President Clinton.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Television and the presidency. On this program, we'll take a look at the most powerful office in the world, coupled with the most powerful medium. Together, they've changed the course of history. The American presidency is not an inherently strong office. It was designed that way. Only in foreign policy and military affairs does the president have what we might think of as real unquestioned authority to make things happen. Of course, for the second half of the 20th century, the nation was consumed with, that's right, foreign policy and military affairs. So it shouldn't be surprising that the power of the presidency would be in such sharp focus during that time. Hi, I'm Tony Snow. Welcome to part 3 of our special presentation, Television and the Presidency. Tonight, we'll watch television coming of age as the world it was showing us changed dramatically.
The cataclysm of World War II thrust America onto a new stage. The country found itself front and center in a clash of titans, followed by a Cold War with the Soviet Union that would dominate world politics for half a century.
And they will see you say it on television.
And just as the country was coming to terms with its new role, another power emerged. America's messy process of electing its leaders, widely misunderstood overseas, was in an unaccustomed spotlight here at home. Those seeking the highest office in the land had to deal with television's strange new power. Presidents did their best to tame it.
You have summoned me on behalf of millions.
To use it to their advantage.
Go to a summit without any agreement at a lower level. Hasn't changed, sir.
well, I'm going to have a dinner for all the people who've written it, and we'll see who eats what.
And sometimes it did its best to tame them.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
In most newsrooms, people play a game of gotcha. If they can get a politician mad, if they can get a politician off balance, if they can get a bad picture, then they won at the game of gotcha.
If I had a nickel for everybody who's come up to me since 1988, who's heard me speak, who said, gee, you're nothing like the guy we were watching on television. You know, you're funnier, you're more spontaneous, this, that, and the other thing. Don't ask me why, but it's a very rare skill. That is, this ability to be able to be yourself on television.
Would American voters have signed the loan certificate for him on Election Day? Of course not.
Television has become an inevitable force for the moment. It has changed politics dramatically. It has allowed the politicians to go over the head of the reporters in the old press conference, over the head of the headline writers, over the head even of other politicians. The president now can talk to you directly, and the heck with Congress.
I think that there's a war going on now between the people on the television side and the people on the political side. The war is quite natural because the battleground is television.
From 1950 to 1980, America changed from a victorious, proud, seemingly united people to a sometimes toothless giant, besieged on all sides, unsure of its role. Presidents from Dwight Eisenhower to Jimmy Carter had led us, but they were never sure they were leading in the dance with television.
When you think of the last 20 years, it is television which defines our candidates. We know about Ronald Reagan's strength because he turned and said,
I am paying for this microphone, Mr. Hill.
Washington politicos on both sides of the aisle still talk about the Reagan Revolution, but television and the images that make it so effective are always part of the conversation.
I had 10 or 15 C.B. DeMilles out there always looking through the lens.
From the moment of his inauguration, Ronald Reagan managed to instill in the public a sense that all was right with the world. It was a made-for-television moment. The revolutionaries in Iran, who had held 52 American hostages for more than a year, chose to release them at the moment the American presidency changed hands.
it is time to check and reverse the growth of government, which shows signs of having grown beyond the consent of the governed.
He said to me, Mike, if you get word that those Americans have crossed into American airspace, even if I'm making my speech, you come up and interrupt me.
Well, that didn't happen, but it didn't have to. The television networks found out, and they did the interrupting. Those who saw the inauguration unfold in person didn't know, but those who watched on television saw their new president as though he were personally presiding over the release of the hostages.
Thank you.
The Reagan team understood very well the power of these television images.
Most of us talk about kindness and compassion.
And they set about creating their own images, using heroic and timely backdrops from which to stage the imposing Reagan presence.
I was presenting exciting, dramatic, and entertaining television for the evening news, and so, and I had the greatest stage in the world. I had the White House and a great president.
It's a cliche now to say that Ronald Reagan was the great communicator, but he was terrific. He knew, when the red light went on, he knew what to do.
Win just one for the Gipper.
Reagan was an actor. In fact, that's how most people knew him. But he was more than that. He had served as governor of the largest state. And he was the first ever card-carrying union member to win the White House. Reagan had been elected 7 times as president of the Screen Actors Guild.
Ronald Reagan was a man of his times. What he believed and what he talked about and what he articulated was what the country was thinking at the time, the majority of the country.
I am not frightened by what lies ahead, and I don't believe the American people are frightened by what lies ahead.
And so he was almost like looking in a mirror. He was a direct reflection of the country. He was much deeper than just his ability as a trained actor.
Randy! Randy! Where's the rest of me?
But he was an actor, and so was his life partner, Nancy. She understood the power of television. If a camera was nearby, Nancy's eyes were on him, and Reagan had been a hired spokesman.
For General Electric, here is Ronald Reagan. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, Giselle McKenzie stars on the General Electric Theater.
Television was nothing new to Ronald Reagan.
As a matter of fact, we can take television with us in this house.
We didn't work with him on TV presentation. We worked with him on content and that sort of thing, but he knew more about television presentation than we did.
How can anyone doubt that our best days are yet to come?
And he had 2 or 3, you might say, secrets, although he talked about them. One of them was that you look at the camera, because you're not looking at the lens, you're looking through the lens. As a result, those people on the other side of the camera watching television got the feeling that he was talking directly to them.
It was important for the president's message that all the space around his head ought to amplify the audio message.
The lady standing there in the harbor has never betrayed us once.
The pictures of him at D-Day with the Statue of Liberty in all sorts of different scenarios were all very important in that, because he looked like a leader, he looked confident.
The Reagan administration was probably the high point at that time, when television news producers appreciated what it was that the political side could produce for them. And Mike Deaver was a master at it.
On the one hand, the print media thought it was dishonest, thought it was underhanded, thought it was manipulative, and would report on it. On the other hand, the television networks loved it because the visuals were so beautiful. I mean, Mike Deaver was talented.
I was competing with all the other bureaus around the world at the evening news desks in New York with the other producers for the story that was going to get on the evening news. One morning, they came into my office early in the morning and said, "We've got some good news. Housing starts are going up." And this would be a real indication that the president's economic recovery plan was working. So the average person that's sitting there watching the television that night looks and he says, "What's the president doing in that framed out house?" And he listens for a second. He says, "Oh, housing starts are moving up. Ah, things must be getting better." I had 10 or 15 CB DeMilles out there all the time. They happened to be 25 years old, but They basically were always looking through the lens.
But it didn't always go as planned.
What we're here for today, the wildlife refuge and everything.
That has a lot to do with it.
I'm not going to give you a different lead.
That has a lot to do with it.
Coming up to the '84 election, Reagan needed to beef up his environmental credentials. It was one of his weaknesses in the polls. So they took the president out to Chesapeake Bay. Reporters asked the president about some other controversy that was bubbling along in the news that day. And Reagan, who was very genial, started to answer, started to talk about it, but it was not about the environment. So immediately, the press secretary, Larry Speakes, called lights, meaning they had to turn off the lights.
You gotta go next.
So now the president is in the dark, and the president continued to speak. So Larry Speakes, the president's press secretary, stepped in front of the president while he was talking, threw his arms up so that no one could see Reagan talking or hear him, even though TV continued to shoot.
And eventually, some in television felt used.
There's a famous story, you know, about Leslie Stahl having done a story about Reagan, and he was in some glorious backdrop.
Leslie took pictures of Ronald Reagan, the only picture she could take, where Deaver created pictures, which were wonderful to look at. And she was going to do a tough piece on his policy. And her copy was tough. Afterwards, she received a call, I believe from Deaver, saying, thank you very much for that piece.
Afterwards, Dick Darman called her and congratulated her on a great piece. And she said, well, I can't believe you're thinking it's a great piece. It was, you know, damning you all the way through. And he said, oh, nobody pays any attention to the voiceover. They're just looking at the visual.
This whole question of television and the presidency took on a special focus during the Reagan years because the people who didn't like Ronald Reagan used the idea of television and the idea of television presentation as a way of explaining what they thought was the inexplicable, which is to say Reagan's extraordinary popularity.
I got to tell you something, you know, people say to me, you know, Ronald Reagan's image maker, all of this baloney. The only thing I ever did for Reagan was to light him.
We will always remember. We will always be proud. We will always be prepared, so we may be always free.
Ronald Reagan took Washington and the world by storm. Network news divisions since Watergate possessed of a self-assured and cynical view of all things politic found their correspondents searching for new inside sources, while they, like the rest of us, marveled at the power of the images they themselves were feeding us. It was heady stuff, but it almost ended before it got started.
I didn't know I was shot. In fact, I was still asking, what was that noise? I thought it was firecrackers.
It was the morning of March 30th, 1981. Ronald Reagan had been in office only 2 months. The government, even the Congress, was falling into step behind his leadership. He was headed across town to the Washington Hilton Hotel to speak to a labor group. And by all rights, Ronald Reagan should have felt pretty good about life and his presidency that day. He didn't know, of course, that a young mentally disturbed John Hinckley was headed to the same place.
When Lincoln was shot, it took 7 days for word to reach London. When Reagan was shot, it took less than 7 minutes for word not only to reach London, but the chief correspondent for one of the major British newspapers was alerted to Reagan's being shot because his editor, sitting in London, saw it on television, like that.
I think I got the first call from the Secret Service telling me that someone had shot at the president. At that time, we didn't know he'd been hit.
I didn't know I was shot. In fact, I was still asking, what was that noise? I thought it was firecrackers.
We were there when they brought the president in, or at least when they wheeled him out of the original examination room into surgery. That's when he looked up and said, hey fellas, is anybody watching? Who's watching the store?
Gentlemen, I just wanted to touch upon a few matters associated with today's tragedy. First, as you know, we're in close touch with the Vice President.
Al went straight up those stairs and he went into that briefing room.
I don't think anybody could have anticipated how intense those lights were. It was a surreal experience to walk in that briefing room.
And should the president decide he wants to transfer the helm to the vice president, he will do so.
Who makes that decision, Mr.
As of
Secretary,
now,
if
I
he
am
can?
in control here in the White House, pending return of the vice president.
His answers, for the most part, were very good, but that was the one time he made a mistake when he said, "I'm in charge here." And that moment on television cost him. It cost him his chance to run for president.
I am in control here.
That shooting was the defining moment for Ronald Reagan as president.
Sure, when I saw all those doctors around me, too, I said, I hope they were all Republicans.
It was that sense of humor that Reagan showed when he was hovering near death that I think really won people over. And they couldn't see that on television, but they heard about it. And the next time they saw him was essentially when he came into the well of the House of Representatives.
You wouldn't want to talk me into an encore, would you?
It was Reagan who told Deaver, television seldom lies. These moments that I think are called naked moments, when you can see into the inner character of a person, and you suddenly realize who he is.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike.
When air traffic controllers went on strike in violation of the law, Reagan just fired them, paying no heed to the hue and cry from organized labor.
And if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. End of statement.
It was the kind of direct action that made his enemies nervous. One enemy in particular.
I would agree to a freeze if only we could freeze the Soviets' global desires.
And that's the event at which he called the Soviet Union an evil empire.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
The opposition party and others said, "Oh, touch, that old cowboy, he doesn't understand. He just doesn't understand how to be diplomatic." Well, he knew darn well what needed to be said and what needed to be done.
The Soviets have built up a massive arsenal of new strategic nuclear weapons.
The Cold War was entering its fourth decade, and Reagan had campaigned on a peace through strength platform. But the president had a surprise in store. Not just more ships and cruise missiles, something he would call the Strategic Defense Initiative. Others would call it Star Wars.
This was an unusual situation in which the networks became a handmaiden to help the president. It was unwitting on their part. It wasn't conscious. It wasn't intentional. We never had a chance to produce any animation of our own. And it was the networks, which had much deeper pockets than the White House, which came up with various forms of animation. Every time an enemy missile went up, you saw the American response, and it knocked it right out of the sky. And if you were the average citizen watching this, you said, this will work.
Managing the flood of dramatic images was a mission for Michael Deaver and his team. Dissatisfied with the tired old blue drape used to stage presidential press conferences, Deaver decided to kick it up a notch.
We decided we'd open up the doors to that magnificent cross hall where the people can see the gild and the chandeliers and the carpeting. I mean, it's a magnificent backdrop.
The picture of the president striding up the hall toward the East Room on the red carpet, walking up to the podium for a news conference is a great television shot. Every reporter in television will use that.
Well, please be seated.
He set Ronald Reagan at the door to the East Room, and the chairs were set up in the back of the room, sort of, so that when Reagan finished, he could turn around and escape.
Our people, Sam, just got tired of seeing me in the old set.
The press fundamentally disagreed with much of Ronald Reagan's policies, but they couldn't disagree with him because he was entirely too likable.
Even a photo op for the press can be a television image minefield. South Africa's Bishop Desmond Tutu came to call amid hard-fought disagreements over the use of economic sanctions in that country.
The president's fidgeting uncomfortably, and then the meeting is not a very good meeting, and it doesn't last very long. So the next day, the press can't wait to get to him. They come rushing into the Oval Office and they say, "Mr. President, what about your meeting with Bishop Tutu? What about Tutu, the meeting with Bishop Tutu?" President Reagan looked at him and he said, "Tutu?" He said, "So-so."
Next weekend on Part
hand. The fact that he looked good on television didn't hurt. But there was more to it than that. We'll be back with that story after the latest headlines from the Fox News desk. Welcome back to Television and the Presidency. I'm Tony Snow. June 1984 marked the 40th anniversary of the D-Day invasion to liberate Europe from Nazi Germany. It was an event that captured the imagination and focused the nation's attention as few others have. It also provided a platform for the American president that was uniquely suited to television. It was a great TV moment, Ronald Reagan in France, atop the cliffs of Normandy, an image that helped set the stage for one of the country's great re-election landslides.
These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. And these are the heroes who helped end a war.
It was a short trip from the beaches of Normandy to Ronald Reagan's re-election theme in 1984.
This is America, spring of '84. And this is America.
The year began with a landmark State of the Union address.
The President of the United States.
And Reagan at the top of his form.
America is back, standing tall, looking to the 80s with courage, confidence, and hope.
It's morning again in America. America today is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
A large field of Democrats vied to challenge the supremely popular Reagan. But the Cold War still raged, and as this dedicated band sniped with each other over a largely domestic agenda, the television networks seemed unimpressed.
Mr. Mondale's hopes for a quick and decisive lead in all this hasn't been fulfilled, and I believe I've heard him use the word clobbered.
There were familiar names in the running. The Reverend Jesse Jackson mounted the first ever serious challenge by an African American. John Glenn, the hero astronaut. Richard Nixon's 1972 opponent, George McGovern. Former Vice President Walter Mondale. And a Colorado senator named Gary Hart.
Where it shouldn't just be jobs, it should be the opportunity to own and operate businesses that create jobs.
When I hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef?
Where's the beef? Hey, where's the beef?
Fritz, if you'd listen just a minute, I think you'd hear. No, you haven't.
Your voice and your vote are the heartbeat of this nation's future.
Everything I talked to them about, they loved Gary Hart. He was new, he was young, he was exciting, and he was fresh. How about Mondale? Mondale was old, he was tired, he's part of the old bosses.
I think they understand immediately.
Then I turned and said, okay, let's suppose there is one of those really serious war peace issues. The red phone's in use. Who do you want, Gary Hart or Walter Mondale? Every hand shot up for Walter Mondale. Why? He's stable, he's serious, he's seasoned, he knows the ropes. We made an ad. It was called The Red Phone. Single longest running ad for a political campaign.
The most awesome, powerful responsibility in the world lies in the hand that picks up this phone, Mondale. This president will know what he's doing.
But Mondale would have to do something dramatic to close the gap with Reagan. Naming a running mate would be his opportunity.
Fritz Mondale knows what America is really about, and I'm honored to join him in this campaign for the future. Thank you.
When I got the nomination, the whole thing was tremendous. It was all of a sudden, at me. I had not a clue. Not a clue of how to deal with the national press.
A nuclear freeze is not a slogan.
The Ferraro candidacy was a shot in the arm for the Democrats. But with no more surprises, how would they draw a television audience for their national convention that summer of 1984? 2 memorable speeches provided the drama.
How can anyone say that we are safer, stronger, or better? Throughout this campaign, I've tried to offer leadership to the Democratic Party and the nation.
As the ovations roared on, the television audience grew and grew, reaching 33 million. These were tough acts to follow. But there were those who wondered if Walter Mondale hadn't undermined all the thunder that had been generated in his behalf.
Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did.
It wasn't a message America wanted to hear, and Walter Mondale could not charm his way past that.
Charm is extremely important, but the message is also always important, and Reagan was a combination of the two.
In 1980, we asked the people of America, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
Put that together with his charm, and it was a devastating combination.
But there was still the matter of debates.
I might as well just go with
You want to go with your,
I don't
okay,
think so.
you want to wait?
I'm all confused now.
Technically you did.
He literally got lost in his last answer. And for the first time, there was a sort of boomlet of age stories.
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale.
All of a sudden, we all took a deep breath and said, oh my gosh, could we really win this? And the answer was no, because at the second debate, Reagan came in, and in his masterful way, the issue disappeared and the election went south.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
You know, there are moments in campaigns where there's just an accidental picture, happenstance, that somehow captures where the campaign happens to be. With Mondale, he'd gone to a paper factory. He was late, he missed the shift change. The company felt bad, so they went in and brought him a sample of the product from the company, a roll of toilet paper, which at that point seemed like a pretty apt commentary on where the campaign was headed.
Are we going to win this election?
Mondale won in his home state of Minnesota and in Washington, D.C. Ronald Reagan took the other 49 states. It was one of the most stunning blowout elections ever. One more battle won for Ronald Reagan, but there was still a battle ahead with television, and the Russian bear was still out there.
Some people say the bear is tame. Others say it's vicious.
Television and the presidency. As 1985 began, the economy was strong and growing. Americans had just awarded their president with a huge re-election victory, and they enjoyed the popular image of Ronald Reagan as Dragon Slayer, standing up to would-be enemies both at home and overseas. But the image Americans saw in their living rooms on the evening of February 6th was a powerful icon with one apparent major dragon left to slay.
There is a bear in the woods. For some people, the bear is easy to see. Others don't see it at all. Isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear.
The Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, met with Reagan often in summit meetings. The two, in fact, developed an uneasy friendship. But time was running out for the Soviets' communist system. The irony was that Reagan's strong words sometimes provoked those in his own bureaucracy more than the target of his foreign policy.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
They sent it over to the State Department to be vetted, and they crossed it out. Oh, that's too mean.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
The National Security Council wanted it out. The State Department wanted it out.
Sent it back to Reagan, and he put it back in.
It's naive. It's unfair to raise German hopes.
The State Department, they crossed it out again. And
I got yanked into meeting after meeting after meeting.
The president put it back in and used it.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
It may well have been Reagan's refusal to drop the Star Wars defense proposal that pushed his summit partner into a corner he couldn't get out of.
The Soviets weren't sure that Star Wars would work, but they thought it could work. And that made all the difference, because they recognized they couldn't build it. In effect, when they saw they couldn't keep up, they sued for peace. We don't know yet to this day whether it's actually going to work as a military weapon, especially in preventing massive attack. But I think it worked wonderfully well as a diplomatic weapon.
The Reagan military buildup was costing millions. Congressional Democrats wouldn't budge on domestic spending, so the nation's deficit was rising at a record rate. But terrorist threats were still more potent than any budgetary dispute, and television kept those threats front and center.
I repeat, we must land at Beirut.
Terrorists, be on notice. We will fight back against you in Lebanon and elsewhere.
When Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi was deemed responsible for one terrorist act, Reagan took action.
Air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities.
But the networks were less open to White House staging now, and not all the televised images worked as planned. In the fall of 1986, Reagan's help for Nicaraguan rebels had so angered congressional Democrats that they passed an amendment forbidding continued aid. Reagan considered the move cruel and probably unconstitutional. He also faced the plight of Americans held hostage in Lebanon. Somewhere, these two foreign entanglements in opposite corners of the world got linked.
In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
The hearing will please come to order.
When an oddball plot surfaced, linking cash from the Middle East for the Contras with release of the hostages in Lebanon, the anti-Reagan forces pounced on it.
Colonel North, please rise.
Now there were all the ingredients for a real television drama. There was the gung-ho Marine colonel and the popular president caught up in the web.
Is that true, or were you deceived and lied to?
Aren't you saying that terrorists can gain from the holding of hostages? How can you justify this duplicity?
Poindexter, did they deceive you?
Reagan had not faced a situation quite like this before. He again went before the cameras, but it was a different Ronald Reagan that America saw that night.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Did Don Reagan deceive you?
The questions kept coming. The graceful exit designed by his handlers didn't work this time.
Reagan, of course, had the famous other way of ducking questions. He looked as if he would also like to come and answer the question, but he just couldn't hear. It worked very well.
While others were found guilty of various misdeeds, Reagan himself was not. But Iran-Contra would haunt the popular president for the rest of his administration, and the next president as well.
The exchange was extremely nasty on both sides. I've never seen Dan so thoroughly rattled.
News Channel special, Television in the Presidency. Television was changing. It wasn't nearly as accepting of the Reagan stage managers as it had been, but the images of an aging Ronald Reagan doing what he did so well were still compelling, and they resonate with us yet.
6, we have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God.
15 seconds, velocity 29 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
According to his biographers, Ronald Reagan could empathize with the public perhaps more effectively than with his own family. And there have not been many who could transfix an audience as he could.
Laju vam uspeka.
Even as the campaign to succeed him had begun, Ronald Reagan traveled to Moscow, to the very heart of the old evil empire, and using a medium he understood better than most, delivered a quintessential Reagan message directly to the people of a dying Soviet Union.
But progress is not foreordained. The key is freedom. Freedom of thought. Freedom of information.
Reagan would be president for another 8 months, but his focus now would be on helping his trusted vice president become his successor.
George Bush, ready on day one to be a great president.
It would not be easy for George Bush. No sitting vice president had been elected since Martin Van Buren more than 150 years earlier. Besides, several Republicans wanted the job, including Kansas Senator Bob Dole. Some familiar Democrats were in the race, dubbed the Seven Dwarfs. Jesse Jackson was back, Missouri Congressman Richard Gebhardt, and a young senator from Tennessee named Al Gore. Then there was Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. He didn't start strong, but two others did. Delaware Senator Joseph Biden, thought by many to be the strongest challenger, and Colorado's Gary Hart, well rehearsed from 1984. Television would not be kind to this field. Joseph Biden was accused of plagiarizing early in the race, and that's all television said about him. He was out of the running before the first primary. Gary Hart lasted a little longer.
I'm different because I'm a reformer. Other candidates are afraid to rock the boat.
Speaking of boats, it was on one named Monkey Business that his bid for office ended. Television's treatment of Gary Hart may have been brought on by Hart himself.
Would you say it was risky, what you did?
I didn't think so of it at the time.
But it would foreshadow a new style of coverage, seen with another candidate just a few years later. There weren't many Democrats left standing, and Dukakis was the strongest.
In all of my campaigns, including the presidential campaign, I had one absolutely strict rule, and that was we never put anything on television that I didn't approve. Ever.
I had had endless conversations with my candidate about running negative ads and going negative. And he insisted that he would not do it. And at the very last minute, Gebhardt went negative and ate us for lunch.
Gebhardt stands for the Save the Family Farm bill. Dukakis won't take a stand. He says our farmers have to diversify and grow blueberries, flowers, and Belgian endive.
Dukakis is furious. I said, do I have permission to go negative? He looks at it twice. He says yes.
Congressman Dick Gebhardt has flip-flopped on a lot of issues. He's been both for and against Reaganomics.
Gebhardt says this, and then Gebhardt says this.
For and against raising the minimum wage.
And we had this going back and forth.
Congressman Gebhardt, he's still up in the air.
And we thought we are on to something here.
George Bush and Bob Dole on leadership.
On the Republican side, polling showed a Dole surge in the last weekend before the vote in the New Hampshire primary. Bush consultants used their media savvy to get a new attack ad on the air at the last minute.
Bob Dole straddled, and he just won't promise not to raise taxes. And you know what that means.
George Bush was a loyal vice president. That proved to be a problem in his race for the top job. Democrats pointed to his subservience to the imposing Ronald Reagan, and television reinforced the image whenever the two were seen together. Newsweek magazine dubbed it the wimp factor, and the Bush campaign decided to fight it early.
When the future of the free world hangs on presidential leadership, experience counts.
An opportunity to shed the wimp label came from an unlikely source, CBS News and Dan Rather.
I forget the exact quotes, but they're going to they're going to destroy him in this interview.
The Bush people had agreed to do an interview live because they wanted it live. And when they got on, Rather started pushing Iran-Contra and suggesting that Vice President Bush had to have known more than he was saying.
The exchange was extremely nasty on both sides. Bush threw out a reference to probably the worst point in Rather's career.
We even saw some numbers move on that interview because he stood up, and I think people admired that.
George Bush would overcome the wimp factor and would be the Republican standard bearer in 1988. But both parties would first stage elaborate summertime conventions with television in mind. A future president would give a very long speech. The delegates would be most grateful when it ended.
In closing,
Jesse Jackson would deliver another spellbinding speech.
I was born in the slum, but the slum was not born in me.
Candidate Michael Dukakis would not do as well.
But we must always remember that our greatest strength comes not from what we possess, but from what we believe. Not from what we have, but from who we are.
I want a kinder and gentler nation.
Candidate George Bush would deliver a home run.
I will keep America moving forward, always forward, for a better America, for an endless, enduring dream and 1,000 points of light. This is my mission, and I will complete it.
Bush's speech would also include a line that would come back to haunt him.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
George Bush went on to wage one of the toughest campaigns in memory, but the Democrats' Michael Dukakis had a big lead coming out of his own convention.
So we talk about, boy, how did Dukakis go from a 17-point lead to lose it all? He never had a 17-point lead, but he was clearly the front runner.
Whatever the lead had been, it began to erode almost immediately. George Bush Sr. would in 1988 become the first sitting vice president in more than 150 years to be elected to the White House. In part 4 of our special presentation, Television and the Presidency, we'll see the campaign, noted for its withering battle of television ads. Also next time, how television brought us the Gulf War and the return of the Democrats. Thanks for joining us.